Welcome, everyone. Today, I'm going to take you into the most powerful, emotional, and world-changing story of a man who didn't just look up at the stars. He changed the way the world looked at itself. His name is Galileo Galilei. But this is not just a story about a scientist. This is the story of a rebel, a dreamer, a truth seeker who refused to be silent, even when the entire world was against him. This is the story of a man who was punished for being right, a man who was told to shut up, a man who was told to stop thinking, a man who was told to believe what others say. But he refused. He chose truth over comfort. He chose science over silence. He chose pain over pretending. He was not born rich. He was not born famous. But today, the world remembers him as the father of modern science. His story is filled with childhood struggles, family sacrifice, giant discoveries, and the most dangerous thing in history: a mind that refuses to stop thinking. And here's the best part. This story is not just good for your heart, it's also great for your English. Because the way I tell it, in very simple, clear, powerful English, will help you improve your vocabulary, listening practice, speaking, and fluency. So if you want to grow in life and grow in English, then don't just watch the beginning. Watch till the very end. This is not just a biography. This is not just a lesson. This is a movement, and you are now part of it. Subscribe right now, because I promise, the next 4 parts will change how you see life, history, science, and yourself. Let's begin with the very beginning of Galileo Galilei's life. Part 1. The birth of a mind that would not obey. Let's go back in time. Not 100 years, not 200 years, but more than 450 years ago, to the year 1564. At that time, Europe was ruled by kings and churches. There was no electricity, no mobile phones, no science as we know it today. Most people believed that the Earth was in the center of the universe. They believed the sun moved around the Earth, because that's what the church told them. And if the church said it, it was not a theory, it was truth. If you questioned it, you were a sinner. You could be killed. In short, people were not allowed to think differently. And then, on February 15th, 1564, in the city of Pisa, Italy, a baby boy was born. His name was Galileo Galilei. Galileo was not born in a palace. He was born into a poor but intelligent family. His father's name was Vincenzo Galilei. Vincenzo was not just a musician. He was a thinker. He believed in asking questions, testing ideas, and breaking old traditions. He even challenged some rules of music that people believed for centuries. That spirit, the spirit of rebellion, of courage, of thinking freely, was passed on to his son. His mother's name was Giulia Ammannati. She was strict, strong, and wanted her children to succeed. Galileo was the eldest of 6 children. Life was not easy for the family. They had to save money, move houses, and struggle to survive. But from a very young age, Galileo showed signs that he was different. As a child, Galileo was not like other children. He asked too many questions. He loved to look at the sky. He stared at stars for hours. He watched how things moved. He wanted to know why. He didn't just accept what people told him. He wanted to see it himself. Once, when he was just a young boy, he went to church with his father. He noticed a lamp hanging from the ceiling, swinging slowly. Most people just saw a lamp. But Galileo, he saw a pattern. He took his pulse, counted his heartbeats, and he discovered that each swing of the lamp took the same time, even when it moved in small circles. That was one of the first scientific observations of his life. He had discovered something that would later become the foundation of pendulum clocks. And he was just a child. Galileo's father wanted him to become a doctor, because doctors earned good money. So at age 17, Galileo went to the University of Pisa to study medicine. But he hated it. He found it boring. He didn't want to learn about herbs and diseases. He wanted to learn about math, movement, stars, planets, and time. So instead of studying medicine, Galileo secretly started studying mathematics. He borrowed books. He taught himself. He listened to lectures he wasn't supposed to attend. And soon, he was better at math than most of his teachers. Eventually, he dropped out of medical school and decided to follow his passion. This decision was risky. His family was poor. He had no job and no guarantee of success. But he chose the path that spoke to his soul. In his early 20s, Galileo was broke, but his mind was alive. One day, he saw goldsmiths weighing precious metals. He realized that they were not accurate, so he invented something called the hydrostatic balance, a device that could measure the purity of metals by comparing their weights in air and in water. This invention made him famous in his city. People started talking about the young genius from Pisa. He didn't make much money, but his name had begun to shine. At age 25, Galileo got his first job as a mathematics professor in Padua, Italy. He now had a salary. He could support his family, and more importantly, he had the freedom to think, teach, and experiment. He built machines. He studied motion. He questioned everything Aristotle had taught, which was dangerous because Aristotle's teachings were treated like law. But Galileo didn't care. He didn't want to worship old books. He wanted to observe the real world, and that's exactly what he did. Galileo was now in Padua, a beautiful city filled with students, thinkers, and artists. It was part of the Republic of Venice, which was much freer than other parts of Italy. People here were allowed to think, to discuss, to debate. It was the perfect place for a young scientist who didn't want to follow rules blindly. He was now a professor of mathematics at the University of Padua, one of the best universities in Europe. His lectures became famous because he spoke with passion. He didn't just read from books. He demonstrated experiments right in front of students. When others said, "Because Aristotle said so," Galileo said, "Let's test it." He taught geometry, mechanics, and astronomy. He was curious about how things move, why they fall, and how fast they travel. And every time he saw something, he wanted to know the reason behind it. He would roll balls down inclined planes, drop objects from towers, and time their motion carefully. There were no stopwatches back then, so Galileo used water clocks, containers that dripped water at a steady rate. By measuring the amount of water that dripped, he could measure time. This is how he began to understand something revolutionary. The speed of a falling object does not depend on its weight. For centuries, people believed, because Aristotle had said, that heavy objects fall faster than light ones. Galileo's experiments showed that this was wrong. If you drop a 1-kilogram ball and a 10-kilogram ball from the same height, they reach the ground at the same time. He even climbed the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped 2 balls to prove it, shocking everyone who watched. The church did not like such demonstrations because they contradicted the old teachings. But Galileo didn't stop. He believed that truth should come from observation, not from authority. Even though Galileo was now respected as a teacher, he was still struggling financially. Professors in those days didn't earn much. He had to support his family, and soon he also became a father. He never married, but he had a long relationship with a woman named Marina Gamba from Venice. Together they had 3 children, 2 daughters, Virginia and Livia, and 1 son, Vincenzo. Galileo loved his children deeply, but his daughters faced difficulties because they were born outside marriage. In that era, society judged such children harshly. To protect them, Galileo later sent both daughters to a convent to live as nuns. His eldest daughter, Virginia, took the name Sister Maria Celeste, and she would become one of the most important emotional supports in Galileo's life. Her letters to him, full of love, comfort, and faith, show a side of Galileo few people know, a gentle, caring father with a wounded heart. But during this period, Galileo had no time to rest. His mind was on fire with curiosity. In 1609, something extraordinary happened. News spread across Europe that a Dutch lensmaker had built a small instrument that could make distant objects appear closer. It was called a telescope, though it was still very primitive. When Galileo heard about it, he immediately decided to build one himself. Without seeing the original design, using only his imagination and mathematical knowledge, he began grinding and polishing lenses by hand. Within days, he created his own version of the telescope, and then he improved it again and again. His first telescope magnified images 3 times, his next one 8 times. And soon, he built one that magnified objects more than 30 times. That small instrument, made from wood, glass, and patience, would change the destiny of humanity. One clear night, Galileo pointed his telescope toward the moon. What he saw shocked him. Everyone believed the moon was a perfect, smooth, divine sphere. But through his telescope, Galileo saw mountains, valleys, and craters. He realized the moon was a world, not a perfect heavenly body. Then he turned his telescope toward the Milky Way, that soft, cloudy band of light across the night sky. To the naked eye, it looked like a mist. But through Galileo's telescope, it became something unimaginable. Millions of tiny stars. For the first time in human history, people saw that the sky was not what they thought it was. Then, one night, Galileo looked at Jupiter, the giant planet. To his surprise, he saw 4 small stars near it. But the next night, they were in different positions. And the night after that, they moved again. He watched them for days and realized they were moons orbiting Jupiter. This was the first proof that not everything in the universe revolved around the Earth. That discovery shook the world. Galileo quickly published his findings in a book titled Sidereus Nuncius, The Starry Messenger, in 1610. It became an instant sensation. He described the moon's mountains, the stars of the Milky Way, and Jupiter's moons. His words traveled across Europe. Scientists were amazed, philosophers were confused, the church was suspicious. Suddenly, Galileo became a celebrity. He was invited to the court of the Grand Duke of Tuscany and was made the chief mathematician and philosopher to the Duke. He now had wealth, respect, and freedom. But fame also brought danger. Because Galileo's discoveries supported the ideas of Nicholas Copernicus, who had said that the Earth moves around the sun, not the other way around. At that time, the Catholic Church had declared the idea of a moving Earth as heretical, against the Word of God. Yet Galileo's telescope gave clear evidence that Copernicus might be right. And this made the church furious. Priests and scholars started attacking Galileo. They said his telescope was lying, that it created illusions. They accused him of trying to destroy faith and rewrite the Bible. But Galileo wasn't fighting religion. He was fighting ignorance. He believed that God gave humans intelligence so they could discover his creation, not remain blind. He said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forgo their use." He tried to explain that science and faith could exist together, but the church didn't want to listen. For them, power came from control, and control came from silence. And Galileo was a man who refused to be silent. Galileo continued his observations. He turned his telescope toward Venus, the bright planet that shines in the evening and morning skies. What he saw next became the strongest evidence for the Copernican system. Venus showed phases, like the moon. Sometimes it appeared full, sometimes half, sometimes as a thin crescent. This could only happen if Venus orbited the sun. That meant the sun was truly at the center, not Earth. It was undeniable. Galileo had the proof. But his proof was too dangerous for his time. By 1616, the tension between Galileo and the church had grown unbearable. The church officially banned the teaching of the heliocentric sun-centered theory. Galileo was warned not to speak or write about it again. He obeyed, for a while. But deep inside, he knew the truth couldn't be buried forever. He wrote letters to his students and friends, encouraging them to observe, to test, to think. He became a symbol of intellectual courage. Meanwhile, his health began to weaken. He suffered from arthritis and severe headaches. Yet, even in pain, he kept writing, teaching, and experimenting. The more the church tried to silence him, the louder his truth became. During this difficult time, Galileo often exchanged letters with his eldest daughter, Maria Celeste, who lived in the convent. Her letters were filled with compassion. She encouraged her father, reminded him to eat, to rest, to keep faith in God's plan. She even baked him cakes and sent them secretly through messengers. In her eyes, Galileo was not just a scientist. He was a good, kind, and loving man. Her words were his only comfort in a world turning against him. By the late 1620s, Galileo had spent over 20 years teaching, researching, and observing the heavens. He had proven that truth could be seen through observation. But the world around him was not ready to accept it. In 1623, a new pope was elected, Pope Urban VIII, who was once a friend of Galileo. The scientist felt hopeful again. The new pope admired Galileo's intellect and allowed him to discuss heliocentrism as a mathematical theory, not as a fact. Galileo saw this as his chance. He decided to write his most ambitious work, a book that would change everything. That book was titled Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. It would become the cause of his greatest triumph and his greatest suffering. Part 2. The book that changed everything. Galileo was now in his 60s. His health was getting worse. He had painful arthritis. His eyes were tired, but his mind was still burning with fire. He knew that time was running out. He had to write down everything he had learned before it was too late. He began working on the most ambitious book of his life, a book that would take all the years of observation, discovery, and thinking. and put them into one single dialogue. A book that would not preach, but discuss. A book that would not directly attack the church, but would challenge the very foundation of what people believed. He titled it, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. It was written as a conversation between three characters. One, Salviati, who represented Galileo himself, defending the Copernican view that the sun is at the center. 2. Simplicio, who represented the followers of Aristotle and the Ptolemaic model, that Earth is the center. 3rd, Sagredo, a neutral man, asking questions, trying to understand both sides. It was a clever idea. Instead of saying, "This is the truth," Galileo let the characters argue. He made the dialogue feel like a friendly debate, but it was clear. Salviati was intelligent and convincing. Simplicio, whose name literally means simple-minded, came across as foolish. Galileo was trying to protect himself by saying, "This is just a discussion, not a statement." But the truth was obvious. The book strongly supported the Copernican view that the Earth moves around the sun. He finished the book in 1632. It was published in Florence, and within weeks, it created a storm across Europe. Scientists were thrilled, thinkers were amazed. But the church was furious, because the book didn't just present an idea, it made the old world view look outdated. It made the defenders of Aristotle look weak. And some church officials felt that Simplicio was secretly a mockery of Pope Urban VIII, the very man who had once supported Galileo. The Pope, who had been Galileo's friend, now felt personally insulted, and the friendship turned into a war. That same year, 1632, the church banned Galileo's book. And in 1633, Galileo, now 69 years old, weak, tired, and sick, was ordered to Rome to stand trial before the Roman Inquisition. The Roman Inquisition was not a friendly group. It was created to punish those who went against church teachings. They had the power to torture, imprison, and even execute. Galileo knew the danger, but he still went to Rome because he believed in truth. When he arrived, he was not allowed to leave. He was interrogated for weeks. He was questioned about the book, about his beliefs, about what he had taught in public. The Inquisition claimed that he had violated a warning given to him in 1616, that he should never support or teach heliocentrism. Galileo tried to defend himself. He said, "I only presented both sides." He said, "I didn't say the Earth moves. I just let my characters talk." But the Inquisition was not convinced. Behind the scenes, pressure was growing. Some powerful men wanted Galileo to be made an example. The church had lost too much power already. They couldn't let one old man destroy their control. They threatened him with torture. They reminded him of what had happened to others who spoke against the church. They told him that if he did not publicly reject his ideas, he could be burned alive. Galileo had faced many storms in his life, but now he had to make a decision. Was he ready to die for the truth, or would he bend to survive? On June 22, 1633, in a grand hall in Rome, Galileo Galilei was brought before the judges of the Inquisition. He was made to kneel, and in front of the world, he was forced to read a statement. In that statement, he denied that the earth moved. He said he had made a mistake. He said he would never again speak or write about the earth moving. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply obeyed because he wanted to live. Some say that after he stood up, he whispered the words, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Did he really say it? We may never know. But those words became a symbol, a whisper louder than a shout, a sentence that told the world, "You can silence my voice, but not the truth." After the trial, Galileo was not executed, but he was given a harsh punishment. He was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. That meant he could not travel, not teach, not write freely, not meet friends, not go to public places. He was a prisoner in his own home. He was first kept in a house near Siena. Later, he was moved to his own villa in Arcetri, near Florence, the same place where his daughter, Maria Celeste, lived in the convent. Even though he was under house arrest, she stayed in contact with him. She cooked for him, prayed for him, and wrote letters filled with love. But just months after his trial, tragedy struck. In 1634, his beloved daughter Maria Celeste died from illness. Galileo was heartbroken. He had lost not just a daughter. He had lost his closest friend. His health worsened. His body became weaker. His eyesight began to fail. By the year 1638, Galileo was completely blind. He had spent his whole life watching the stars. Now he could see nothing. And yet, he didn't stop. Even in blindness, even in isolation, Galileo kept working. During his house arrest, Galileo was allowed to receive a few visitors. One of them was a young student, Vincenzo Viviani, who would later become a famous scientist himself. Another was Evangelista Torricelli, the man who invented the barometer. Galileo dictated his thoughts to them. He couldn't write anymore, but he could still think. He could still dream. And in that darkness, he completed another major work. 2 new sciences. This book did not talk about the universe. It talked about physics, motion, strength of materials, speed, acceleration, and mechanics. Even under arrest, even after being silenced, Galileo was creating the foundation of modern science. The book was smuggled out of Italy and printed in the Netherlands in 1638, far from the hands of the Inquisition. It became one of the most important books in the history of physics, even without sight, even without freedom, even without his daughter. Galileo kept giving the world new ways to think. He was broken in body, but his mind remained a cathedral of light. As the years passed, the world began to change, slowly. More scientists across Europe were building telescopes. They were seeing the same things Galileo had seen: Jupiter's moons, the phases of Venus, the rough surface of the moon, the stars in the Milky Way. The truth could no longer be hidden. The ideas Galileo was punished for were now being taught in universities. The model of a sun-centered universe was now becoming the standard. But Galileo did not live to see it fully accepted. By the end of 1641, Galileo was very weak. He had spent the last 8 years as a prisoner, blind, in pain, and isolated. On January 8, 1642, at the age of 77, Galileo Galilei took his last breath. There was no celebration, no grand funeral. The church didn't allow it. He was buried quietly near Florence. But the silence would not last forever, because what he gave to the world could never be buried. When Galileo Galilei died on January 8, 1642, there were no public speeches. No statues were made. No honors were given. He had been a prisoner of the church. He had been silenced, judged, and punished. And yet, the ideas he left behind were already too big to destroy. Because while his body was buried quietly, his truth was not buried at all. The telescope he pointed to the sky, it had already opened a door. and millions were ready to walk through it. His books? They were being copied, translated, and secretly studied in countries across Europe, especially in the Netherlands, Germany, France, and England. His words? They were becoming louder after his death than they had ever been during his life. And that's where his true power began. Because Galileo didn't just make discoveries. He changed the way of thinking itself. Before Galileo, people believed what they were told. After Galileo, people started to ask, can I test it? Can I observe it myself? Can I prove it with logic? This change, this shift from faith in authority to faith in evidence, was the beginning of a new age, the scientific revolution. And the man at the heart of that revolution, the man who lit the spark, was Galileo. In the decades that followed his death, his ideas spread like wildfire, even as the church tried to keep control. New thinkers and scientists began building upon Galileo's work. In Germany, a man named Johannes Kepler had already begun to publish mathematical laws of planetary motion. He believed in the heliocentric model and used mathematics to show how planets moved in elliptical orbits, not perfect circles. Kepler and Galileo never met in person, but they respected each other deeply. Kepler wrote letters encouraging Galileo, and Galileo's telescope gave real physical proof that matched Kepler's equations. This combination, observation and mathematics, became the foundation of all modern science. Then came René Descartes in France, a philosopher who famously said, "I think, therefore I am." He supported Galileo's way of doubting, testing, and reasoning. The spirit of logic and method was now alive across Europe. But the most important person who picked up Galileo's torch was born in the very same year that Galileo died. In 1642, the year of Galileo's death, in a small village in England, a baby was born. His name was Isaac Newton. And as Newton grew up, he studied everything that Galileo had discovered. He learned about falling objects. He read about acceleration. He saw how Galileo had questioned Aristotle and dared to think differently. Newton once said that his own success came because he was standing on the shoulders of giants. One of those giants was Galileo. Newton would later develop the laws of motion, the law of universal gravitation, and create a new form of mathematics called calculus. It's almost poetic. Galileo showed the world that the apple falls. Newton showed why. But Galileo's impact wasn't just limited to science. His life story became a symbol of courage, of rebellion, and of freedom of thought. Writers, artists, and philosophers saw Galileo as a man who had fought power with truth. Voltaire, the great French philosopher, called him a martyr of reason. Plays were written about him. Books were inspired by him. And slowly, the church itself began to change. At first, they stayed silent. But time has a strange way of forcing the truth to rise. In 1718, more than 75 years after his death, the church lifted its ban on Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. It could now be published, but only in a corrected form. Still, it was progress. Then, in the 1800s, scientists around the world started to publicly celebrate Galileo as the father of modern science. His birthday, February 15th, became known in some parts of Europe as Galileo Day. Schools began teaching his work. Towns and cities named streets after him. Telescopes and observatories were built in his honor. And yet, the biggest moment of justice had not come yet. Because the Catholic Church, the very institution that silenced him, judged him, and locked him away, still had not admitted its mistake. That would take time. A lot of time. Fast forward now. Not 10 years, not 100 years, but 350 years after Galileo's trial. In the year 1992, Pope John Paul II, the head of the Catholic Church, stood in front of the world. He gave a historic speech, and in that speech, he said something the Church had never said before: that the Church had been wrong to condemn Galileo, that Galileo was a man of faith and science, and that his punishment had been unjust. The Church officially cleared Galileo's name, more than 3 centuries after his death. The truth had finally been accepted. The voice that had once been silenced was now being honored by the very power that had tried to destroy it. It was late, but it was beautiful. Galileo's influence also reached space. In 1989, NASA launched a spacecraft named Galileo to study Jupiter and its moons, the very planets he had seen with his telescope 400 years earlier. That spacecraft sent back thousands of images. It discovered new details about the atmosphere of Jupiter, the structure of its moons, and the movement of its rings. In many ways, it was as if Galileo's eye had returned to the stars, not through wood and glass this time, but through steel, fire, and space. When the spacecraft ended its mission in 2003, it was crashed into Jupiter's atmosphere. A final poetic goodbye. A man who once stood on Earth and looked at Jupiter was now having a machine named after him become part of that very planet. Even today, Galileo's name continues to shine. There are craters on the moon named after him. There are schools, universities, museums, and science institutes around the world carrying his name. He is studied in every physics class, every astronomy course, every scientific textbook. In Italy, near Florence, where he had lived his last years in house arrest, now stands a tomb of honor. Inside the great Basilica of Santa Croce, the same church where Michelangelo is buried, Galileo's body was moved there in 1737, nearly 100 years after his death. People from all over the world come there to pay respect to the man who refused to be silent. But his greatest legacy is not in stone. It's not in space. It's not even in science alone. His greatest legacy is in how we think. Today, when a child asks, "Why does the moon change shape?" When a student wonders, "How do I know what's real?" When a scientist says, "I need evidence before belief," that is Galileo's voice living on. Because Galileo taught us that. You don't have to be powerful to speak truth. You don't have to follow the crowd to find the path. You don't have to be perfect to change the world. You just need one thing: a mind that will not obey blindly. And that is why Galileo Galilei is more than a scientist. He is a symbol. Part 3. The man behind the genius. Now that the world knows what Galileo achieved in the skies and how his legacy transformed science, it's time to walk into a quieter space, into the man's private world. Because behind every revolutionary, there is a human being. Behind every discovery, there is doubt. Behind every truth-teller is a heart that breaks in silence. Let's begin with what history rarely tells you: the cost of being Galileo Galilei. He was not born into money, and even during fame, he was constantly struggling financially. As a young man, he had to teach, tutor, and build devices just to keep food on the table. Not only for himself, but also for his extended family. He supported his brothers, sisters, his mother, his children, and even servants when he became established. He was responsible for many lives. And even though he was well known, the money never matched the fame. His inventions were praised, but not patented. Others copied his ideas. He gave lectures, but universities often delayed or reduced his pay. He had to write letters begging for salary he had already earned. That was the reality. His scientific spirit was pure. But the world around him, politics, egos, power, was anything but pure. Still, Galileo worked harder than ever. And during the day, he was solving the universe. But at night, he was writing letters to secure jobs for family members or to defend himself against jealous rivals. He was a provider, a father, a teacher, a fighter, and a prisoner of truth. All at once. Now let's finally talk about how he changed the world of science. Not just what he discovered. Galileo didn't just look at the sky. He measured it. He didn't just guess. He tested. He didn't just say, "I believe." He said, "I observed it with my own eyes." And you can too. Here are some of the core scientific breakthroughs he gave us, explained in the simplest way for all learners. 1. The law of falling bodies. People believed that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. Galileo proved that all objects fall at the same rate, if there's no air resistance. He did this by rolling balls of different weights down slopes and measuring their time. 2. The concept of inertia. Aristotle believed that things stop moving when you stop pushing them. Galileo proved that if there's no resistance, a moving object will keep moving forever. This concept would later become Newton's first law of motion. 3. The principle of the pendulum. He discovered that the time it takes for a pendulum to swing depends only on its length, not on how far it swings. This would become the basis for pendulum clocks, which helped humans keep accurate time for centuries. 4. The scientific method. Before Galileo, people just read old books and believed what was written. Galileo introduced the method of experimentation, observation, and repetition. He said, "Don't believe something just because someone said it. Prove it." 5. The moons of Jupiter. With his telescope, he saw 4 moons orbiting Jupiter. This destroyed the idea that everything in the universe revolves around Earth. It proved that other objects in the sky could have their own systems. 6. The phases of Venus. He showed that Venus goes through phases just like the moon. This was possible only if Venus was orbiting the Sun, not Earth, another proof of the heliocentric model. 7. Sunspots and the imperfect heavens. The Church taught that celestial bodies were perfect and unchanging. Galileo observed sunspots, dark marks on the surface of the sun that moved and changed. This shattered the belief in perfect heavens. Galileo didn't just give us facts. He gave us a new lens to see the world, literally and mentally. He showed us how to ask questions, how to doubt, how to test, and most importantly, how to keep going even when the world calls you wrong. And let's not forget what made him different from many other scientists of his time. He could write beautifully. His books were not just academic. They were lively, funny, and easy to understand, filled with dialogues, characters, and storytelling. He wrote for ordinary people, not just professors. He wanted everyone to understand the universe, not just those with degrees. In that way, Galileo was not only the father of science, he was also the first science communicator, the first to say, "This knowledge belongs to everyone." His voice was silenced. His books were banned. His eyes were blinded. His daughter was gone. His freedom was taken away. But one thing remained untouched: his mind. And that mind changed the world more than any sword, crown, or law ever could. Part 4. The Final Light of Galileo. In the 1800s, the world had changed. The Industrial Revolution was beginning. Machines, engines, factories. Everything was being built on the laws of motion, gravity, and energy. And all those laws had their roots in Galileo's work. In classrooms, his name became a regular part of textbooks. In lectures, his methods were studied and praised. In universities, his books were printed freely. His once banned ideas were now called fundamentals. In the 1900s, the 20th century saw a complete transformation. Space travel, atomic physics, quantum theory, and relativity. But his story didn't stop there. In the 2000s, the world began to celebrate Galileo in new ways. In 2009, to mark the 400th anniversary of his first telescope, the United Nations declared the year the International Year of Astronomy and honored Galileo as the father of that field. Across the globe, scientists hosted stargazing events, built replicas of his telescope, and told his story to new generations. In art, in poetry, in science fiction, in space missions, his name appeared everywhere. Let's talk about something deeply symbolic. The Galileo spacecraft. Launched by NASA in 1989, the spacecraft traveled to Jupiter, the very planet Galileo had observed through his handmade telescope. It arrived in 1995 and spent years studying Jupiter's atmosphere, rings, and moons. It discovered facts Galileo could only dream of. It recorded lightning on Jupiter, studied the planet's magnetic field, and even gave clues about possible oceans beneath the icy surface of its moon Europa. Then, in 2003, the spacecraft was sent into Jupiter's atmosphere. A planned end to the mission. But think about that for a moment. A man who once looked at Jupiter through a glass tube now had a machine named after him, crashing into that same planet, carrying human curiosity to its edge. Back on Earth, his story continues to grow. Today, there are schools named after him, statues built in his honor, telescope brands with his name, a lunar crater named Galilei, a moon of Jupiter named Galilean Moon, a GPS satellite system in Europe called Galileo, a 3D digital museum in Florence where his original tools, books, and even bones are preserved. Even in death, he continues to inspire scientists, writers, philosophers, and English learners around the world. And now, we reach the true end. Not just the end of a man's life, but the meaning of that life. So what did Galileo really teach us? Not just that Earth moves, not just that stars are made of fire, not just that science is real. He taught us something far bigger. He taught us that you must ask questions even when others are afraid. You must believe in truth even when no one claps for you. You must keep going even when the doors are closed. You must choose knowledge over fear. You must dare to look through your own telescope and see the world for yourself. He taught us that one man, standing alone with a piece of glass pointed at the sky, can challenge an empire. And that truth, even if whispered, will one day be louder than all the lies. That is the story of Galileo Galilei, a man who was not a king, not a soldier, not a saint, but a man who believed that light travels farther than darkness. And today, that light is still shining. In every classroom, in every telescope, in every sky, and in every mind that refuses to stay silent. Thank you for listening. Now you know his story, not just the facts, but the feelings, the pain, the sacrifice, and the victory. This story was also a lesson in English, in life, in courage, and in humanity. If you're here at the end, you are part of something special. Now go, ask your questions, build your own telescope, and carry forward the fire that Galileo started. Because the stars are waiting for you. This was the story of the man who brought heaven closer to earth, and earth closer to the truth. Galileo Galilei, forever remembered, forever shining.